He was an up-and-coming rapper. She was a rising star in real estate.
So when she wasn't at home, when she said she was gonna be at home, I was getting worried. I'm calling her 100 times, 90 times, back to back. She's not picking up. Next thing you know, somebody coming through the door. Somebody wearing a black mask, all black. He sees me on the stairs, just gets the firing. Boom, open the door. I was in the daze. I couldn't move. I just didn't want to die in front of my kids. I'm in a drug-induced coma until the next day. I wake up. They told me she passed away. She was shot and killed. I didn't think it was real.
This murder couldn't have happened the way it did without her participation. She helped him.
She was fearful of losing him.
She had a good job. She seemed to be living a really good life.
He had his hands in the drug trades.
He lived a very glamorous lifestyle. She was willing to go to extreme lengths to remain part of that lifestyle. She would do whatever he asked, often without question.
He must have had some sort of charm, and she stuck by him because she was in love with him.
They deserve street justice, but that's not up to me, that's up to God.
New Year's Eve, 2019, Minneapolis, Minnesota. At 5:40 p.m., 911 dispatchers receive a frantic call from a resident named John Mitchell Momo.
He was telling dispatch that he had been shot, that he was dying. He referred a few times to his children being in the house.
It elicited a rapid response by emergency medical technicians and police.
When officers initially arrived, they're seeing blood in various places going up the steps. There were .45 caliber shell casings at the base of the stairs. It's clear that that's probably where the shooter was standing.
They find Momo. He is upstairs laying on the floor in a bedroom covered in blood. He had been shot somewhere between 4 and 6 times. He wasn't coherent.
John Momo is loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital as officers turn their attention to his children.
You're trying to make sure is that the people in that scene are safe. And in this case, that included 2 very small children.
There was a 1 and 3-year-old. Fortunately, neither child was injured.
At the time that officers arrived, Mr. Momo was the only adult in that house. Officers did not know where the children's mother was. And so we had neighbors that were coming out, engaging with officers, and one of those neighbors had the phone number for the mother of the children, Monique Bao.
A neighbor tries to call her on their cell phone. They receive no answer. The neighbor said, well, I also know her mother. So the neighbor calls Monique's mother, Wanda.
Wanda lived relatively nearby, and so within 15 to 20 minutes, I want to say, Wanda actually got to the home and could care for the children.
Wanda expresses concern for her daughter Monique as soon as she arrives.
Right. No one's heard from her.
Monique's mother not only takes care of the young children who are present, but also provides some pretty critical information, which is that there is Monique's key, and it's a pretty unique key to the front door of their home, and it is in the house. So that key may have been used to gain entry into the house.
So the question becomes, how did Monique get separated from her own key? Was she kidnapped? Was she harmed? Was she hurt at all? Was she a part of what happened to Momo?
Monique's mother provides to officers that Monique's car is actually missing, which is a BMW.
There was the equivalent of an all-points bulletin out for Monique's vehicle, for a dark-colored BMW SUV.
I'm just really scared for my daughter. I'm really scared.
In coming hours, detectives receive an update from the hospital.
They had a pretty good indication, the investigators did, that John Momo was going to make it.
I was in a daze. I didn't know that I was shot up. I didn't even know what was going on. I was just so much under drugs, I don't even remember. I didn't know who could have did that.
29-year-old John Mitchell Momo grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
It was cool. really diverse. Family life was good. Good, you know, loving family. Played sports, basketball, friends, and then music. I'm part Nigerian, so, you know, like music and beats, dancing is like in my blood.
Like Momo, Monique Bao was born and raised in Minneapolis.
I met Monique when we were teenagers. When I first seen her, it was like in a movie, you see the person across the room, like all eyes on her. Everybody would want to be around her. Beautiful, outgoing, the popular girl. She was like the girl I always wanted to be with. Like I always had a crush on her, but it was a friendship, really.
After high school, John relocated to Georgia to focus on making a name for himself in the rap industry under the stage name Momo.
I graduated high school, then I moved to Atlanta, doing his music, his rap career. Every single day, just grinded away. And eventually, things started to happen. Like, the more you work, the more you receive. I started working with artists like Rick Ross, Nipsey Hussle, XXX, Tentacion, Yo Gotti. List really can go on for days.
Momo eventually moved back to Minneapolis, where fate brought Monique back into his life.
We bumped back into each other, you know, started hanging out a lot, and then it turned into a relationship. They could say it felt like a dream come true. Monique learned she was pregnant. It was one of the greatest things ever. She was happy. We were excited. Eventually had children, 2 little girls. She was the best mom. We were just excited. She had just became a real estate agent, and she was doing great, just killing it.
I feel truly blessed. I'm learning from the best agents in the industry, and I really just want to spread this knowledge, this joy that I have.
Just fell in love with it. You know, they say if you love what you do, it's not a job. And that's what I truly felt like she felt real estate was for her. So everything was good. It looked like it was set in stone. And then tragedy hit.
Now, John Momo is at the hospital in critical condition, and Monique is nowhere to be found.
Wanda was extremely concerned about Monique right away. All that was on her mind was, where's my daughter? And at that point, there was definitely strenuous efforts to find Monique's whereabouts.
Within a couple of hours, there is a shooting that occurs in a different part of North Minneapolis.
This is approximately 4 miles from where Momo was shot.
It's a residential area. Officers who respond to that location discovered a woman in an alley who had been shot multiple times.
The victim had been bound with gorilla tape just obnoxiously around her hands and around her neck. The victim was clearly deceased. She had been shot once in the face and a couple times in the abdomen. Her purse wasn't around. They couldn't make an identification, but they start to wonder if this is related to that home invasion.
Officers who respond to that location would have been aware of the other shooting, so officers got in touch with the investigators at the home to try and determine if perhaps this was the woman that they were looking for. Oftentimes when someone doesn't have identification on them, but you do have family members who know things like tattoos, that is a thing that officers will typically ask about, and Monique's mother was able to give officers information.
Ma'am, does Monique have any tattoos?
Yes. She has one at the very bottom of her pelvis that says heartbreaker.
Okay, thank you.
Officers were able to identify this victim as Monique as a result.
That's the mother of the 2 kids from this one. Yep, because she just said the heartbreaker tattoo.
The murder of Monique, the shooting of John. Investigators needed to try and look at any potential option in terms of what a motive might be
Why on earth would somebody have wanted to kill Monique Bao and John Momo?
Coming up, a mysterious figure is caught on tape.
The larger male comes walking out of the garage. Minutes later, you see Monique Bao being forced into the back of that U-Haul.
And investigators uncover a complicated plot.
Hi, Monique. I'm calling because I actually wanted to set up a walkthrough, maybe tomorrow morning.
He needed to have him killed, and she helped him lure Monique to her death.
Hours after 29-year-old John Mitchell Momo was shot in an apparent home invasion, his longtime girlfriend and the mother of his 2 children, Monique Bao, has been found murdered in a Minneapolis alleyway.
The shell casings at the residence were .45 caliber shell casings. And very quickly, it was clear that the shell casings where Monique was found were also of the same caliber, .45 caliber shell casings.
This kind of a situation is highly unusual. They realize that these shootings are definitely related.
Some of the first things that officers will do at any crime scene is canvass the neighborhood looking for additional evidence, witnesses, surveillance footage, and they were also able to locate some video footage.
What the video cameras showed at and around that alley was a U-Haul rental truck circling the block, closely followed by this tan-colored Buick. The tan Buick pulls up a side street and parks. The U-Haul went up the alley, and then you see a black male come walking from where the tan Buick parked. He walks around the corner, down the alley. There were 3 shots, and then the U-Haul leaves the alley.
Unfortunately, in the surveillance footage from the alley, there were no really clear images of license plates. So the information that they would have obtained from that surveillance footage was communicated out to officers still looking for Monique's car, which was not present in that video.
Every police department in the metro area was looking for her BMW SUV. On about 10:45 that night, the Maple Grove Police Department finds her vehicle in the driveway of a home that was for sale. They called in the license plate, told Minneapolis, "We've got the vehicle you're looking for." 2 investigators go there immediately, and right away they search the home.
They're going from room to room, and they don't find anything at all, except for a single pink acrylic fingernail just lying on the floor.
That acrylic fingernail matched some that Monique was wearing.
After searching the residence, they did the same thing that they did at the scene of Monique's killing. They scoured for surveillance footage, and they found a Nest camera at a residence directly across the street, which was a big break in the case. So from the Nest camera, the investigators watched Monique pull up into the house in her BMW. Shortly thereafter, a U-Haul rental truck is seen driving slowly. And it pulled into the driveway.
One person gets out of the U-Haul truck and goes into the house. A short time later, the second person in the U-Haul truck gets out and goes into the house. Then you see a garage door open and 3 people come out, one being forced into the back of this U-Haul, presumably Monique. And then they drive off in the U-Haul, but the camera footage is such that you can't make out faces or license plate.
While officers continue searching for the U-Haul, detectives receive word that miraculously, John Momo is in stable condition.
So the investigators arrive at the hospital. He's really emotional. They've just broken to him that Monique has been shot and killed.
I wake up, find out that Monique gone. It was crazy. I didn't think it was real. I see it, man. I thought it was fake, man.
Although he's in shock, detectives need to ask Momo to recount the previous day's events.
Monique began receiving messages from an individual who was indicating that she was very interested in purchasing this house in Maple Grove.
It was a woman who had called her trying to set up the showing. She left, went to that showing.
She said she'd be home at a certain time, and she wasn't home. I started calling back to back to back. I was getting worried, and there was no answer.
He said he was sitting on the top of the stairs trying to contact Monique, and at that time he heard the front door unlock and observed an African-American male dressed entirely in black with a ski mask walking through his front door, and before any words were exchanged, this individual began shooting at him.
I get up, run to the room. I thought he was finna come upstairs and finish me. He flees. It was crazy. So my arm worked for a minute, enough for me to call the police. And my arm stopped working. I couldn't move. My baby come upstairs crying. My other baby was laying right next to me, so I knew it was okay. I just didn't want to die in front of my kids.
Investigators say, do you have any idea who might have done something like this?
There was nobody that I could think of could do that to me.
It's always important to understand why, because that's part of what leads to the what. And particularly in a homicide case and a shooting case, officers want to know who is it that might be angry.
They shot him and left. That makes you wonder, for some reason, was Monique the target?
Within 24 hours of the double shootings of 29-year-old John Mitchell Momo and his girlfriend, 28-year-old Monique Bao, Monique's autopsy is performed.
It became pretty clear that Monique had most likely been tortured.
In addition to the 3 gunshot wounds, Monique had a chipped tooth, a number of abrasions, contusions, and some pretty significant injuries to her fingers where her acrylic nails had been ripped off. Why would somebody do this to this wonderful person? Could it be gang-related? Could it have something to do with Momo's rapping connections? Certainly, the rap culture is prone to violence at times, but Monique was not part of that lifestyle, had literally nothing to do with it. We theorized that somebody was using her to get to Momo. During the autopsy, they were able to pull 6 latent prints off the adhesive side of the tape that was used to bind Monique Bao.
When detectives run the prints through the database, they get a hit.
Those fingerprints matched up to Cedric Berry.
Cedric Berry is not someone who is a stranger to law enforcement. Currently under investigation at the time for narcotics trafficking. He had an extensive criminal history that included crimes of violence like robbery and assault. He had a prior conviction for manslaughter and a series of narcotics-related charges and convictions. The best part from an investigative lens was he also owned a tan Buick.
Authorities immediately put out a bolo for Cedric Berry. The same day, detectives' efforts to locate the U-Haul from the security footage are successful.
The U-Haul went between point A and point B, point A being that home in Maple Grove and point B being that alley. And are there cameras along those routes that we might be able to find?
They estimated where it would have been driving at a certain time, and sure enough, they got the hit.
They do ultimately find additional footage and footage that finally gives them a license plate.
They tracked this U-Haul down the next morning at a rental place in Mounds View.
Investigators are able to get into the back of that U-Haul truck.
One thing they notice right away is this U-Haul reeks of ammonia and bleach. It's actually puddled up in the back end of it. So they're thinking cleaning agents, but there were a number of bloodstains on the interior and on the outside of the U-Haul. So the perpetrators were not as thorough as they thought they were. They find some Gorilla Tape wrapper in the passenger side door. Investigators were aware that was the tape that was used to bind Monique.
In addition, investigators find more of the pink acrylic fingernails that they are able to connect to Monique.
Detectives also determined that Cedric Berry had rented the U-Haul.
The investigators know they need to speak with Cedric Berry at least.
Cedric Berry has an associate by the name of Barry Davis, who has been with him at various times while being under surveillance by this narcotics investigations team.
A police officer from one of the drug task forces had them under surveillance. She says they're at the Doubletree Hotel, both of them right now. And at that point, the Minneapolis PD, along with the St. Louis Park PD, pounced on that hotel. So January 2nd, 2 days after the murder, Cedric Berry is placed under arrest. He's taken back to the station. But while they were arresting Cedric Berry, Barry Davis sprints out the front door of the hotel and gets away.
The other thing that investigators obviously are trying to do is determine if Barry Davis is one of the people that is on the video that shows Monique's abduction in Maple Grove. And he has, from a height and build and weight perspective, it is certainly possible that he could be one of those people in that video.
While authorities put out an APB for Barry Davis, Cedric is transported to headquarters for questioning.
Cedric Berry asks for an attorney, and that is the end of law enforcement being able to have that conversation with him. What they do, however, is get a search warrant for his Buick.
In the tan Buick, they find two-way radios. They find a black ski mask, exactly as described by John Momo as being worn by the assailant. Significantly, they find gorilla tape in the trunk. That's the tape that was wrapped around Monique Bao.
We go back and have a conversation with John Momo about Cedric Berry and who Cedric Berry is. And John is very clear, I have no idea who Cedric Berry is. And Monique didn't know Cedric. And so investigators now are left with no clear idea of why Cedric Berry would have engaged in this homicide, this shooting. They begin to wonder if, in fact, Cedric was doing it on behalf of someone else.
We need to figure out who this could be.
Less than a week after the murder of Minneapolis realtor Monique Bao and the attempted murder of her boyfriend, John Mitchell Momo, police have one of at least two suspects in custody.
Given the fact that Momo had no knowledge of Cedric Berry and neither did Monique as far as we know, why would Cedric do something this brutal?
When detectives receive Momo and Monique's phone records, they turn first to Monique's, hoping to identify the individual who requested to see the Maple Grove house on New Year's Eve.
Investigators know that the number that had called her to set up this showing that she was abducted from had left a message.
Hi, Monique. My name is Lisa Pulowski, and I'm calling because I'm interested in one of the properties, and I actually wanted to set up a walkthrough, maybe tomorrow morning.
When detectives run a background check on Lisa Pulowski, however, they discover the name is a fake.
At this point, the narcotics investigators who happens to be investigating Cedric Berry and Barry Davis listen to that voicemail, and someone thinks they recognize the voice as a probation officer that they have had contact with in Hennepin County. And they believe that the person whose voice they're listening to is Elsa Segura.
She had been a probation officer and was the girlfriend of a known drug dealer, Lyndon Wiggins. Lyndon Wiggins was a person police have been after for a long time.
Lyndon Wiggins is the type of narcotics dealer that you see in the movies. He had a great deal of financial success. He traveled extensively to exotic locations. Elsa Segura was romantically involved with him, and she could be referred to as a ride or die individual. She would do whatever he asked, often without question.
So, recognizing Elsa's voice suggests that Lyndon might be involved in what has occurred.
And at that point, we realized we needed to look a lot harder at Lyndon Wiggins.
So investigators go have another conversation with John Momo about Lyndon Wiggins and about who Lyndon Wiggins is.
I first met him in the club through one of my managers at the time.
Lyndon also happens to be involved in the music scene and in the rap scene, the local rap scene, and has had in the past a feud with John Mitchell Momo.
Lyndon Akeem Wiggins went by the name L.A. He was a record producer for a label called Black Bag Entertainment. In the beginning, L.A. and Momo, they got along, but things became strained.
He said he wanted to do some music, and he said he was gonna put $1 million into me. He never did, you know. And then he turned into wanting to be the artist. He wanted to rap. Well, like all the songs I had made, he wanted to hop on the song.
The record label took Wiggins off of a song that they had produced together, and L.A. blamed Momo for that entire action.
He was took off a song that we had with Nipsey Hussle, and I heard he was pissed.
In addition, L.A., one of his operations was busted by the cops. And L.A. publicly called Momo, called him out and said, "You're a snitch."
Yeah, I heard that he was going around telling people that I told on him and stuff. It was all a lie. There's no truth behind none of that.
Momo would corroborate that he had moved into that condominium with Monique specifically so Lyndon Wiggins wouldn't know where to find him. We started to theorize that Wiggins said, well, let's get to Monique. We know she's a real estate agent. We'll lure her to this house, abduct her, and force her to give us up where Momo is.
Armed with intel from Momo, detectives bring Elsa Segura in for questioning on January 14th and play her the voicemail left on Monique Bao's phone.
Are you familiar with that call?
I am familiar with the call.
Okay. We don't think you're a bad person. We think someone got you wrapped up in some stuff, is what I believe, and just need to hear your side of the story and give you a chance for explanation before your name got drugged any deeper.
Okay. I mean, I made a phone call, but I didn't know what was going to be the outcome of that phone call. I think I'd be more comfortable if I have the lawyer present.
All right. I wish you the best of luck.
Her first interview with police was nothing more than listening to the voice message saying, yes, that's me. I want a lawyer. That was it. So she was charged originally with kidnapping because we could not place her at any of the crime scenes.
Hoping to strengthen their case, authorities subpoena phone records for Elsa Segura and Lyndon Wiggins.
One of the critical aspects when they arrested her, they got her physical phone. And so not only do you get phone records, you get text messages and the content of what she's searching for in social media. She was consuming any media that was available about the murder of Monique Bao, and then she'd research confession times at the Basilica. It was pretty damning evidence of a guilty conscience.
One of the challenges in this case was that the cell phone that made the call was not Elsa's phone. Based on the phone number from the phone records, they were able to determine that it was what we refer to as a burner phone.
They tracked down the purchase of that cell phone, obtained surveillance video from the cell phone store, and it showed Cedric Berry purchasing that phone. And then Lyndon Wiggins, the cell phone records would show, was right outside that store.
With John Momo back at home with his children, authorities know they need to act fast to keep him and his family safe.
If Lyndon Wiggins is willing to go to these lengths to sort of carry out this kind of violent plot, it was likely that John Mitchell Momo might be still in danger.
Police believe a sham real estate showing on New Year's Eve unleashed a terrifying chain of events on an unsuspecting Minneapolis couple. Elsa Segura and the suspected gunman, Cedric Berry, are behind bars, but the alleged mastermind, Elsa's boyfriend, Lyndon Wiggins, has not been arrested.
It certainly appeared to investigators that the reason for this homicide was really connected to Lyndon. None of the other individuals had any kind of clear, direct connection to John Momo or to Monique. In the case of tying Lyndon Wiggins to this murder and this shooting, almost all of the evidence was circumstantial.
Much of the information we used came directly from Elsa Segura's cell phone. She was communicating with Wiggins saying, hey, we have to clean up our cloud storage as well, and then walking him through how to do that. Not activities of a particularly innocent person.
You've also got GPS data related to Lyndon's phone, and some of that GPS data puts him in places like the store where the burner phone was purchased. So there are pieces of evidence that connect him to people and to locations, but not necessarily to the crime itself. In this case in particular, officers wanted some other way, frankly, of getting Lyndon Wiggins off the street. There were conversations between the two sets of detectives about, I don't have enough yet for this homicide case. Do you have enough to get him into custody on the narcotics case? And so he was ultimately arrested on narcotics charges rather than the homicide charges.
Eventually, the homicide investigators have an opportunity to sit down and speak with Lyndon Wiggins.
Police, they ask him about Monique's murder. They ask him about Momo's shooting. Wiggins says, I don't know what you're talking about.
Often in cases where you have multiple suspects, we'll be trying to figure out which of those suspects is most likely to flip on their co-conspirators. And in this case, the most likely person to be willing to talk about her co-conspirators was going to be Elsa.
Over the course of the indictments, she came in.
As investigators, you take that opportunity to build a relationship with that person, to get them to trust you. So investigators learned more about Elsa's history.
Born in 1992, Elsa Segura grew up in Minneapolis.
I want to say I was 9 years old when I met Elsa. We're childhood friends, and we were inseparable, our group. She was sweet, very sweet. She lived with her two sisters and her mother. Her family life seemed very quiet and personally knit. Like, her mom was very strict, but in a good way. She was very determined, very headstrong with whatever it was that she wanted to do.
She went to school for criminal justice, wanted to be involved on the right side of the system, had become a probation officer in Hennepin County.
You know, she had a good job. She seemed to be living a really good life.
Authorities learned that Elsa's history with Lyndon Wiggins goes back nearly a decade.
Elsa ultimately had known Lyndon since she was a teenager, young adult. They had met up a couple of times through the years. Their paths had crossed.
They were kind of on and off for a couple of years. They met when they were a lot younger and didn't date, and then ended up dating. He lived a life where he was part of this rap business record label. He also had his hands in the drug trades.
He lived a very glamorous lifestyle. She got to take part in that. She got to help him with that. And she was willing to go to extreme lengths to remain part of that lifestyle.
Detectives press Elsa again about her involvement in this case.
She was asked by Lyndon Wiggins to call this number and asked to set up a house showing. But again, she told investigators that she did not know what was to come from that voicemail. Elsa did not know Monique Bao. She hadn't met her before.
She said, "I'm innocent. I didn't know what they were doing."
Following their interview with Elsa, authorities continue building their case against Lyndon Wiggins. 4 months after the murder, they learn that their fourth suspect has finally been caught.
Barry Davis is located by the U.S. Marshals in Chicago.
He gave no useful information at any point during the arrest, just lawyered up. Cedric Bear and Barry Davis are charged with murder in the second degree.
In May of 2021, nearly a year and a half after the murder, prosecutors are ready to present Lyndon Wiggins' case to a Minneapolis grand jury.
They indicted L.A. Wiggins with the murder of Monique and the shooting of Momo.
But it seems clear he's confident in his position that Elsa Segura's not going to rat him out, and neither Cedric Berry or Barry Davis. He might have a decent opportunity at beating the charges.
Lyndon Wiggins, Elsa Segura, Cedric Berry, and Barry Davis have all been indicted for the New Year's Eve shootings of Monique Bao and John Mitchell Momo.
I think that this murder couldn't have happened the way it did without Elsa Segura's participation. Wiggins' hatred of John Momo had just exploded at this point in time, and he needed to have him killed, and she helped him lure Monique to her death.
In June 2021, Cedric Berry and Barry Davis go on trial together.
There is physical evidence, fingerprints, the evidence from the U-Haul truck, the evidence from Cedric's vehicle, the evidence from the multiple surveillance cameras and videos, and they are convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
Three months later, Elsa Segura's trial gets underway in September of 2021.
The defense that we put forward in the case was the lack of knowledge here. She didn't know why she was making this call. Looking back, she thought that maybe it was related to his drug business.
She said she was fearful of him and that is why she agreed to make this phone call to Monique.
It was an emotionally and physically abusive relationship that she was wrapped into. He must have had some sort of charm, and she stuck by him because she was in love with him.
During cross-examination, Elsa's story begins to fall apart.
My co-counsel, Paige Starkey, conducted 2 hours of a textbook cross-examination that, without hyperbole, was the most brutal cross-examination I have seen in my career. And she caught her in about a lie every minute. It's not possible that she didn't know what she was doing when she contacted Monique Bao. Part of it is the intimate knowledge she had of his drug operation. He didn't do anything without advising her and bringing her on board.
It's clear from questions from the prosecutor and her responses that it is also about her desire to keep Lyndon as her boyfriend, that there is something connected to her being fearful of losing him and sort of contradicting her earlier statements that she was fearful of him.
After a few hours of deliberation, we get called back into the courtroom with a verdict.
Elsa was, in fact, convicted of aiding and abetting first-degree murder, and she was convicted of kidnapping.
On the first-degree murder with premeditation, there's only one sentence, and that's life without parole.
Knowing that she was automatically going to prison for life was terrible.
June of 2022, the trial for Lyndon Wiggins takes place. The key point, and the one that we hammered repeatedly, there was no connection between Elsa Segura, Cedric Berry and Barry Davis, and Monique Bao, except for Lyndon Wiggins. That was it, motive, and the only link between the actual killers and the victims. Lyndon Wiggins' defense was this was a robbery that had been set up by Elsa Segura and Cedric Berry and Barry Davis without Wiggins' knowledge. I mean, who's going to rent a U-Haul to rob somebody?
Their theory is that Lyndon paid Cedric and Barry to kidnap Monique in the U-Haul truck and engage with her to try and get access to John's house to harm John.
So I think Monique held out for at least an hour and a half to 2 hours putting up with that in that U-Haul. We suspect Cedric Berry would shoot Momo and then run out the back, get in the U-Haul, and then they'd leave the scene. Then Monique Bao is taken to an alley and she's killed execution style. Lyndon Wiggins was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life without parole. That felt satisfying. The bad guys got what they deserved.
Monique didn't deserve anything that happened to her. So they deserve more than that. They deserve the street justice, but that's not up to me, that's up to God. For a long time, I wouldn't even do nothing, didn't want to do music. Dark times, dark moments. I can't let it stop me. I have to keep going. I have kids. I have to make sure they're okay. Yeah, I want Monique to be remembered as a hardworking, strong, beautiful woman that never gave up, that inspired everyone, and she was going places. She was going places.
For nearly 3 decades, one question haunted an entire community. How does a killer disappear into ordinary life? How does someone walk away from a violent crime scene, leave behind unanswered questions, and then spend years, even decades, believing the past will never return? In Minneapolis, Minnesota, there was a cold case that refused to die. A young woman was found murdered inside her own apartment. The evidence was there. The investigators were there. The unanswered questions were there. But the killer was gone. For years, the name Jeannie Childs remained attached to a file that seemed frozen in time, a case surrounded by silence, frustration, and a family waiting for the truth. Then, decades later, a revolutionary forensic technique would reopen the investigation. A technique that could reach across generations. A technique that could transform distant relatives into a map leading directly toward a suspect. And suddenly, the man who investigators believed had escaped justice was no longer invisible. The past had found him. On June 10, 1993, Minneapolis was like many American cities in the early summer. People went to work. Cars moved through busy streets. Neighbors lived their ordinary routines, unaware that inside one apartment, a violent crime had taken place. Jeannie Childs was 35 years old. She was known by people around her as someone with a vibrant personality, someone whose life was connected to friends, family, and the community around her. But on that day, her life came to a horrifying end. Inside her apartment, investigators discovered a scene that immediately suggested a violent struggle. The details shocked those who knew her. A woman who had lived an ordinary life had suddenly become the center of one of Minneapolis' most disturbing unsolved murders. The apartment became a crime scene. Every object mattered. Every fingerprint, every fiber, every trace left behind had the potential to reveal what happened. But the most important clue was something investigators could not fully use at the time. DNA. In the early 1990s, forensic science was still developing. DNA analysis existed, but the technology was nowhere near what it would become decades later. Investigators could collect biological evidence. They could preserve samples. They could create a genetic profile. But finding the person behind that profile was a completely different challenge. The technology could tell police that evidence came from an unknown individual. It could prove that someone connected to the crime scene existed. But it could not tell them who that person was. The killer had left behind a biological signature. But a name remained hidden. And without a name, the case slowly moved into the category that every investigator fears. Cold case. A file that grows older. A family that waits longer. A community that begins to wonder if the truth will ever come. For years, Jeannie Child's murder remained unresolved. Investigators continued to review the evidence. New detectives examined old files. Advances in forensic science offered new possibilities. But the central mystery remained unchanged. Who killed Jeannie Childs? And why? The case carried all the elements of a nightmare investigation. A victim with a life suddenly interrupted. A crime scene containing clues but no clear answer. A suspect who had disappeared into the world. And a family forced to live with uncertainty. Every cold case has a moment when hope begins to fade. Time becomes the enemy. Witnesses move away. Memories become unclear. People age. Evidence becomes harder to interpret. And sometimes, investigators face the most frustrating reality in criminal investigations. The truth may exist somewhere, but the path to finding it is hidden. For Jeannie Child's family, the years after her death were filled with questions that had no answers. There was no courtroom. No conviction. No moment when someone was forced to explain what happened. There was only the absence left behind. Meanwhile, somewhere in the world, the person responsible continued living. That possibility was one of the most disturbing parts of the case. A murderer could have blended into society. Could have built relationships. Could have created a completely different identity. The crime scene was frozen in 1993. But the person responsible continued moving forward. Then forensic science changed. A new era began. A time when investigators no longer depended only on traditional databases. A time when family connections hidden inside genetic information could become powerful investigative tools. The science was known as forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA searches, which usually compare evidence against criminal databases, genetic genealogy could use publicly available DNA information from people who had voluntarily submitted their genetic profiles for ancestry research. Investigators could look for relatives. Parents. Cousins. Distant family connections. A genetic family tree could become a road map. And for decades-old crimes, that road map could lead investigators toward the person they had been searching for all along. Across the United States, old cases that once seemed impossible to solve were suddenly being reopened. Victims who had been forgotten by time were receiving new attention. Criminals who believed they had escaped forever were being identified. The past was no longer unreachable. And eventually, that new technology would bring investigators back to the murder of Jeannie Childs. The evidence collected decades earlier had survived. The DNA remained. The question was no longer whether the killer had left something behind. The question became: could science finally reveal who that person was? Behind every cold case is a clock that never stops ticking. For Jeannie Childs, that clock had been running for years. But now, after decades of silence, investigators were preparing to reopen a door that had remained closed since 1993. A door that could finally expose the person who had walked away from the crime scene believing he would never be found. Because sometimes, the biggest mistake a criminal can make is believing time protects them. Time can erase memories. Time can change appearances. Time can make people believe they are safe. But time can also preserve evidence. And sometimes, buried inside that evidence, is the one thing a killer cannot escape. A connection. A name. A family line. A genetic trail leading back to the moment when everything changed. For Jeannie Childs, justice had been delayed. But it had never disappeared. And after nearly 30 years, the investigation was about to enter a new chapter, one where modern science would challenge an old assumption: that some killers truly get away. The apartment had long since been cleaned. The blood was gone. The evidence markers had been packed away decades earlier. The yellow police tape had disappeared from the building. Neighbors had moved. New tenants had occupied the same rooms without realizing they were walking across the floor of one of Minneapolis' most enduring mysteries. Time had erased almost every visible trace of what happened on June 10, 1993. Almost every trace. Locked inside an evidence vault, preserved under carefully controlled conditions, was the one witness that never forgot. DNA. Unlike human memory, it did not become uncertain with age. It did not confuse dates or faces. It did not change its story. It simply waited for science to catch up. When detectives reopened the Jeannie Childs investigation years later, they were not starting from the beginning. They inherited shelves of reports, crime scene photographs, interview transcripts, laboratory analyses, and investigative notes written by officers who had long since retired. Every page reflected countless hours of work. Every report showed the determination of investigators who had done everything the technology of their era allowed. The challenge was not a lack of effort. It was the limits of science. The biological evidence recovered from the apartment had already produced a DNA profile years earlier. Detectives knew it belonged to an unknown male. They also knew that profile did not match Jeannie Childs. It belonged to someone who had been inside the apartment during the violence that ended her life. That profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Nothing. Year after year, investigators checked again. Nothing. A match would only appear if the person responsible had previously submitted DNA through a qualifying criminal conviction or if a later arrest resulted in a DNA sample being entered into the system. If neither happened, the unknown profile remained exactly that. Unknown. For detectives, this became one of the cruelest realities of modern investigations. Sometimes they possessed the killer's genetic fingerprint. They simply had no name to attach to it. As years became decades, the Childs homicide joined the growing list of cold cases waiting for a breakthrough that no one could yet define. Then another investigation, thousands of miles away, changed the future of forensic science. In 2018, law enforcement used forensic genetic genealogy to identify the man believed responsible for a series of murders and sexual assaults committed decades earlier in California. That investigation demonstrated something extraordinary. A suspect no longer needed to submit his own DNA. His relatives could unknowingly point investigators toward him. The implications were enormous. Across the country, homicide units began reviewing old evidence with renewed optimism. Cases once considered unsolvable suddenly looked different. The Minneapolis Police Department was among the agencies watching these developments carefully. If another investigation could identify a killer after decades, perhaps Jeannie Child's murderer had also left behind a trail that extended beyond himself. Detectives assembled the available biological evidence and worked with forensic specialists capable of developing a more detailed genetic profile than investigators in 1993 could ever have imagined. The process demanded extraordinary care. Decades-old evidence is fragile. Every sample must be protected against contamination. Every laboratory procedure must withstand scrutiny because if an arrest eventually occurs, every scientific step will be challenged in court. Nothing could be rushed. The evidence moved from storage to specialized forensic laboratories where technicians extracted genetic information far beyond the simple DNA profile originally created years earlier. Traditional forensic testing focuses on identifying an individual. Genetic genealogy examines inherited markers shared among family members. The distinction is critical. Instead of asking, "Who is this DNA profile?" scientists ask a different question. Who could this person be related to? That question begins an entirely different kind of investigation. Genealogists entered the genetic profile into databases that permit law enforcement comparisons under specific conditions. The search did not produce the suspect's name. It produced relatives. Some were distant. Some shared only a small percentage of DNA. None of them were suspects. Yet every one of them represented another branch of the same family tree. Professional genealogists began reconstructing generations of family history. Birth certificates. Marriage records. Obituaries. Military records. Newspaper announcements. Census information. Every document became another piece of a puzzle stretching backward through decades. This work resembled historical research as much as criminal investigation. Family trees expanded. Branches divided. Children became parents. Grandparents led to cousins. Cousins led to additional descendants. Slowly, patiently, investigators narrowed thousands of possibilities into hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became only a handful of men whose ages, locations, and family relationships fit the available evidence. Now the investigation shifted from genealogy back to traditional police work. Every remaining candidate had to be examined. Where had they lived in 1993? Did they have any known connection to Minneapolis? Did they know Jeannie Childs? Could they have encountered her? Were they alive? Were they physically capable of committing the crime? Detectives compared timelines, addresses, employment histories, and known associates. Most candidates were eliminated. One remained increasingly difficult to ignore. His name was Robert Eugene Copeland. Born in the late 1960s, Copeland had lived in Minnesota during the period investigators were examining. His age aligned with the unknown male profile. His background placed him within reach of the city at the time of the homicide. But suspicion alone meant nothing. Detectives needed evidence. Real evidence. Evidence that could survive a courtroom. The DNA from the apartment suggested they were moving in the right direction. Now they needed to determine whether Robert Copeland's DNA matched the unknown profile collected decades earlier. Police could not simply demand a DNA sample without legal justification. Instead, investigators relied upon a technique that had become increasingly common in modern homicide investigations. Surveillance. Detectives watched. They documented routines. They waited for an opportunity to recover DNA that had been voluntarily discarded. A drinking container. A napkin. A cigarette. An item abandoned in public. Once discarded, such items can often be collected lawfully for forensic comparison. Every movement mattered. Every discarded object became a potential source of the answer investigators had pursued for nearly 30 years. The operation required patience measured not in hours but in weeks. Officers remained careful not to alert the subject. If Copeland realized he was under investigation, his behavior could change. He might destroy evidence. He might disappear. He might seek legal advice before investigators were ready. The case had waited decades. Detectives refused to risk everything during its final stages. Eventually, they obtained a discarded DNA sample believed to belong to Copeland. The laboratory comparison began. This was the moment toward which years of renewed investigation had been building. 2 DNA profiles. One collected from a brutal homicide scene in 1993. The other obtained decades later. Scientists performed the comparison according to established forensic protocols. There was no room for assumptions. No room for optimism. Only data. Only probabilities. Only genetics. Investigators waited. Cold case detectives often describe waiting for laboratory results as one of the most difficult parts of an investigation. The evidence already exists. The answers may already exist. But until the science is complete, no one knows whether years of work will end in disappointment or in the breakthrough every investigator hopes to witness. Finally, the laboratory delivered its findings. The DNA profile obtained from Robert Eugene Copeland was consistent with the male DNA recovered from the scene of Jeannie Child's murder. For detectives, the result transformed the entire investigation. The unknown male profile that had haunted the case since 1993 was no longer anonymous. It belonged to a real person. A man who had spent nearly 3 decades living outside the spotlight while investigators quietly followed a trail built not from eyewitnesses or confessions, but from inherited fragments of genetic code stretching across generations. The case that had once seemed trapped in the past suddenly became active again. Phones rang. Supervisors were briefed. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Veteran detectives who had spent years wondering whether the child's file would ever be solved watched as one scientific breakthrough accomplished what thousands of investigative hours alone never could. Yet one question remained unanswered. DNA could place a person at the crime scene. It could establish an extraordinarily powerful connection. But detectives still needed to understand the events inside that apartment. How had Robert Copeland come into contact with Jeannie Childs? What happened during the final moments of her life? And perhaps most importantly, after nearly 30 years of silence, what would the man identified through genetic genealogy say when investigators finally confronted him with the evidence that had survived longer than any alibi, longer than any secret, and longer than the confidence that time could bury a murder forever? For nearly 3 decades, Robert Eugene Copeland had lived without facing questions about the murder of Jeannie Childs. He had grown older while the case file remained trapped in 1993. Detectives retired. Prosecutors changed. Technology evolved. Entire generations entered adulthood without ever hearing Jeannie's name. Yet the evidence had remained exactly where it had always been, silent, preserved, and waiting. Now the silence was over. The laboratory comparison had done more than identify a suspect. It had fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. For years, detectives had been asking, who could have committed this crime? Now they were asking a different question. How do we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? DNA was extraordinarily powerful evidence, but homicide cases are rarely built on a single piece of forensic science. Prosecutors understand that juries want more than probabilities. They want context. They want a timeline. They want to know why a suspect was there, what happened inside the apartment, and whether every alternative explanation has been eliminated. Detectives return to the original investigative file with fresh eyes. Every interview conducted in 1993 was reviewed again. Every witness statement. Every handwritten note. Every crime scene photograph. Every laboratory report. Details that once appeared insignificant suddenly carried new weight. Investigators reconstructed Jeannie Child's final known movements as accurately as possible. They traced her activities during the days leading up to her death, identifying the people she had spoken with, the places she had visited, and the routines that defined her everyday life. The picture that emerged was one of an ordinary woman whose life ended in extraordinary violence. Jeannie had not disappeared. She had not vanished without explanation. Someone had entered her apartment, or had been allowed inside, and before leaving, had left behind a scene that reflected an intense and deadly confrontation. The original investigators had documented signs of a struggle. The apartment was not consistent with a peaceful encounter that had suddenly turned tragic. The evidence suggested resistance. Jeannie had fought. That realization carried enormous emotional weight. Victims of violent crime are often remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. Yet the crime scene also revealed something else. She had tried to survive. She had resisted her attacker. And in doing so, she left behind the biological evidence that would outlive the man who believed he had escaped. The irony was impossible to ignore. The killer's greatest mistake may have occurred during those final desperate moments. What seemed insignificant in 1993 became decisive nearly 30 years later. Detectives also revisited the question that had lingered since the beginning. Did Jeannie know her killer? There was no immediate evidence of forced entry that conclusively answered the question. That uncertainty opened multiple possibilities. Perhaps she recognized the person standing at her door. Perhaps the encounter began peacefully before escalating into violence. Or perhaps the attacker found another way inside. The available evidence could not answer every question, and investigators were careful not to speculate beyond what the facts supported. Instead, they focused on what they could establish. The DNA. The crime scene. The timeline. The forensic evidence. The identity of the suspect. Those were facts. Everything else required careful examination. As investigators built their case, another reality emerged. Time had created both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was scientific progress. The disadvantage was human memory. Witnesses who had spoken confidently in 1993 now struggled to recall details. Some had moved away. Others had died. Addresses no longer existed. Businesses had closed. Telephone numbers had long since been disconnected. Memories that once seemed vivid had faded into uncertainty. This is one of the defining challenges of cold case investigations. Evidence may remain unchanged. People do not. Detectives spent months locating individuals connected to the original investigation. Some still possessed fragments of memory. Others remembered only that a shocking murder had occurred in the neighborhood. Many were astonished to learn that the case had finally produced a suspect after so many years. For Jeannie's family, the news brought emotions that were difficult to describe. Hope. Relief. Disbelief. Pain. The passage of time had not erased their loss. It had merely forced them to live alongside it. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every family gathering. Every milestone that Jeannie never experienced served as another reminder that justice had remained unfinished. Now, suddenly, detectives were saying they had identified the man whose DNA had been preserved at the scene. Nearly 3 decades after the murder. The announcement was almost impossible to comprehend. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining Robert Copeland's background. Who was he in 1993? What was happening in his life? Where had he lived? Who knew him? Were there connections that had gone unnoticed during the original investigation? Detectives searched for any documented relationship between Copeland and Jeannie Childs. Public records were reviewed. Employment histories. Residential addresses. Known associates. Nothing was ignored. Every potential connection mattered because prosecutors anticipated the questions defense attorneys would eventually ask. If the suspect's DNA was present, how did it get there? If he knew the victim, under what circumstances? If he denied involvement, what explanation could account for the forensic evidence? Building a homicide case decades after the crime demands meticulous preparation. Investigators cannot rely on surprise. They must anticipate every argument before it is made. As the evidence accumulated, detectives believed they had reached the point where an arrest could be justified. The decision carried enormous significance. Arresting someone for a murder committed nearly 30 years earlier is unlike making an arrest immediately after a crime. The suspect has built an entirely different life. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers may know nothing about the investigation. Families are affected. Communities are stunned. The past suddenly collides with the present. When law enforcement finally arrested Robert Eugene Copeland in 2022, the case that had spent decades buried in cold case archives immediately became national news. The headlines were striking. DNA genealogy solves 1993 Minneapolis murder. Cold case breakthrough after nearly 30 years. Suspect arrested using family tree technology. The story resonated far beyond Minnesota. It represented something larger than a single homicide investigation. It demonstrated the rapidly expanding role of forensic genealogy in modern criminal justice. Cases once considered permanently unsolved were no longer beyond reach. Across the country, investigators working other cold cases watched closely. Could their evidence also contain forgotten answers? Could another unidentified DNA profile lead to another arrest? For Jeannie Childs' case, however, the science was only the beginning. An arrest is not a conviction. The criminal justice system requires prosecutors to present evidence publicly, allowing defense attorneys to challenge every conclusion. That process would determine whether the decades-long investigation had truly identified the correct man. After his arrest, Robert Copeland entered a legal battle unlike anything imagined in 1993. The evidence against him did not come from an eyewitness who suddenly remembered his face. It did not come from a confession. It did not come from fingerprints newly discovered at the scene. Instead, it came from a scientific discipline that barely existed when Jeannie Childs was killed. Genetic genealogy. The same technology that had rewritten countless family histories had now rewritten an entire homicide investigation. Defense attorneys across the United States were paying close attention. So were prosecutors. The legal implications extended beyond a single case. How would courts evaluate evidence developed through this relatively new investigative method? Would juries understand the science? Would they trust it? Would the decades separating the crime from the trial create reasonable doubt? Those questions were about to move from academic discussion into a real courtroom. And as prosecutors finalized their strategy, one haunting fact continued to dominate every page of the case file. The DNA had never lied. It had waited. Patiently. Silently. For 29 years. Long enough for the world to change. Long enough for technology to catch up. Long enough for a man who may have believed he had left the past behind forever to discover that some evidence does not fade with time. It simply waits for the day someone finally learns how to read the story it has been telling all along. The arrest ended nearly 29 years of uncertainty. It did not end the mystery. The moment Robert Eugene Copeland was taken into custody, the investigation entered its most demanding phase. Detectives had spent years identifying a suspect. Now prosecutors faced an entirely different challenge, convincing 12 jurors that the evidence, preserved across 3 decades, pointed to one man and no one else. Cold cases often succeed or fail inside the courtroom. Time changes everything. Witnesses forget. Evidence ages. Investigators retire. Defense attorneys know this. Their job is not to prove who committed the crime. Their job is to question whether the prosecution has eliminated every reasonable doubt. Every unanswered question becomes an opportunity. Every missing witness becomes a potential weakness. Every faded memory becomes a point of attack. The prosecution understood exactly what they were facing. Their case could not rely on emotion. It could not rely on sympathy. It had to rely on facts. The cornerstone of those facts was DNA. Forensic experts prepared to explain to a jury how biological evidence collected in 1993 had survived long enough to be tested using technology that investigators could not have imagined when the crime occurred. They would have to simplify highly technical science without sacrificing accuracy. Jurors did not need to become geneticists. They needed to understand one essential point. DNA does not guess. It compares. Every person inherits a unique combination of genetic markers from their parents. Modern forensic analysis examines those markers with extraordinary precision. When a crime scene profile matches a suspect's DNA, scientists calculate statistical probabilities so overwhelming that the chance of the profile belonging to an unrelated individual becomes extraordinarily remote. But prosecutors knew that would not be enough. They also needed to explain how Robert Copeland became a suspect in the first place. That meant introducing forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike a traditional Cody search, genetic genealogy does not begin with the suspect. It begins with relatives. Sometimes very distant relatives. People who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to genealogy databases in hopes of learning about family history, ancestry, or unknown branches of their family tree. Those relatives are not suspects. Most have no idea their DNA could indirectly assist a homicide investigation. Genealogists compare inherited DNA segments, identify possible family connections, and reconstruct extensive family trees spanning multiple generations. It is painstaking work. There are no shortcuts. Every birth certificate, every marriage record, every obituary, every census document, every public record must fit together. Only after eliminating hundreds, sometimes thousands, of possibilities does a single individual emerge as a viable suspect. Then comes the critical step. Police must obtain that individual's DNA independently. The genealogy itself is not proof of guilt. It is merely a map. The direct forensic comparison provides the evidentiary confirmation. That distinction mattered. Prosecutors emphasized it repeatedly. Robert Copeland was not arrested because he appeared on a family tree. He was arrested because his DNA, obtained independently during the investigation, was compared directly to the biological evidence preserved from Jeannie Child's apartment. The laboratory comparison linked him to the crime scene. The genealogy simply showed detectives where to look. As preparations for trial continued, another question lingered in the public imagination. What was the motive? It is one of the first questions people ask after every homicide. Why? Why Jeannie Childs? Why that apartment? Why that day? Investigators searched the original file again and again, hoping to uncover a clear explanation. Yet, as in many homicide cases, motive proved difficult to establish conclusively. The evidence identified a suspect. It did not fully explain his state of mind. Violent crimes are often driven by circumstances that die with the people involved. Arguments, impulses, personal conflicts, hidden relationships, failed expectations. Without a confession, some motives remain forever uncertain. That uncertainty frustrated observers. Television audiences often expect criminal investigations to answer every question. Real life rarely does. Justice and complete understanding are not always the same thing. Detectives can identify who committed a crime without ever knowing precisely why. The Child's investigation illustrated that reality with painful clarity. Meanwhile, Jeannie's family prepared themselves for something they had almost stopped believing would happen. Court proceedings. For decades, they had lived with memories instead of answers. Every development reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Old photographs resurfaced. News cameras returned. Reporters requested interviews. The name Jeannie Childs once again appeared across newspapers and television broadcasts. This time, however, there was a suspect. For younger members of the family, the arrest connected them to an event they knew only through stories. For older relatives, it brought them back to the summer of 1993 as though the years in between had vanished. Grief has an unusual relationship with time. It does not disappear. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes quieter. Sometimes it suddenly becomes as sharp as the day it began. The reopening of the case forced everyone connected to Jeannie to confront memories they had spent decades trying to organize into something bearable. Outside the courtroom, the case also fueled a national conversation about forensic genealogy. Supporters viewed it as one of the greatest advances in criminal investigation since the introduction of DNA profiling itself. Cold cases that once collected dust were now producing arrests. Families who had lost hope were receiving answers. Victims whose names had nearly disappeared from public memory were finally being heard again. Critics, however, raised questions about privacy. Should genealogy databases be used in criminal investigations? What responsibilities do companies have to customers? How should law enforcement balance investigative necessity with personal privacy? These debates reached legislatures, courts, and legal scholars across the United States. The child's case became one more example cited in those discussions. For detectives, though, the issue remained simple. A homicide victim had waited nearly 3 decades for justice. The available technology finally made identification possible. Their responsibility was to follow the evidence wherever it led. As legal proceedings advanced, prosecutors organized every piece of forensic evidence into a chronological narrative. The crime scene. The biological evidence. The laboratory preservation. The original DNA profile. Years of unsuccessful database searches. The emergence of forensic genealogy. The reconstruction of the family tree. The identification of Robert Copeland. The independent collection of his discarded DNA. The laboratory comparison. The arrest. Nearly 30 years compressed into a sequence of carefully documented investigative steps. Nothing about the process had happened overnight. The public often sees only the arrest. What remains invisible are the thousands of hours behind it. Scientists. Genealogists. Evidence technicians. Detectives. Laboratory analysts. Prosecutors. Every discipline contributed one piece to a puzzle that had resisted solution for almost 3 decades. As the trial approached, one reality became impossible to ignore. The investigation itself had become part of legal history. Future detectives would study it. Future prosecutors would cite it. Future forensic scientists would point to it as another demonstration that biological evidence, when preserved correctly, can speak across generations. The apartment where Jeannie Childs died had long since become just another residence. People passed by without realizing what had happened there years before. Life had moved on. Buildings had aged. Neighborhoods had changed. But evidence preserved in sealed containers had refused to age in the same way. It had remained frozen in time. Waiting. Waiting for computers powerful enough to process complex genetic data. Waiting for genealogy databases large enough to identify distant relatives. Waiting for investigators willing to reopen forgotten files. Waiting for one final comparison that transformed an anonymous DNA profile into the name of a living man. The killer, if prosecutors were correct, had spent decades believing the case belonged to history. Instead, history had been quietly collecting the tools necessary to find him. And in the end, the most powerful witness in the entire investigation was not a person who remembered. It was a microscopic strand of DNA that had never forgotten. The prosecution's case rested on a paradox that only modern forensic science could create. The most compelling witness in the courtroom would never take the stand. It would never raise a hand, swear an oath, or answer a single question. It had no memory. No emotions. No fear. No bias. It existed only as a sequence of genetic markers preserved from a Minneapolis apartment in the summer of 1993. For the jurors, the challenge was unlike anything previous generations had faced. They were not simply being asked to decide whether a suspect had been identified. They were being asked to understand how nearly 3 decades of scientific progress had transformed a forgotten piece of biological evidence into the centerpiece of a murder prosecution. The passage of time shaped every aspect of the proceedings. By the time the case reached court, the world had changed dramatically from the one Jeannie Childs had known. Technology had reshaped daily life. Entire industries had appeared and disappeared. Children born after the murder were now adults. Yet every question inside the courtroom still pointed back to a single day in June 1993. The prosecution carefully reconstructed that day using the evidence preserved from the original investigation. Crime scene photographs were displayed. Laboratory reports were introduced. Investigators explained how evidence had been collected, labeled, sealed, and stored according to established forensic procedures. That chain of custody became critically important. Defense attorneys frequently challenge old evidence by questioning whether contamination, mishandling, or simple human error could have affected laboratory results. Every transfer of evidence had to be documented. Every seal had to be accounted for. Every laboratory examination required a written record. The prosecution emphasized that the biological evidence had remained under controlled conditions for decades, allowing scientists to perform modern testing without compromising its integrity. Then came the testimony explaining forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike television crime dramas, where breakthroughs appear almost instantaneous, the experts described a painstaking process that required months of research. The unknown DNA profile from the child's homicide was compared against genealogy databases that permit law enforcement use under specific conditions. The search did not identify Robert Eugene Copeland directly. Instead, it identified distant relatives. From there, professional genealogists constructed an extensive family tree using publicly available historical records. Generation after generation was examined. Names were added. Branches were eliminated. Family lines expanded and narrowed. Eventually, investigators arrived at a small group of individuals whose age, geographic history, and family relationships fit the available evidence. Only then did traditional police work resume. Surveillance. Background investigations. Collection of a discarded DNA sample. Direct forensic comparison. The genealogy did not replace detective work. It guided it. That distinction became one of the central themes of the prosecution's presentation. The defense, meanwhile, focused on a different reality. Time. Nearly 30 years had passed since Jeannie Childs was killed. Witness memories had faded. Some individuals connected to the original investigation were no longer alive. Certain questions could never be answered with complete certainty. The defense challenged investigators on what could not be reconstructed. Could anyone state with certainty exactly how Robert Copeland's DNA came to be inside the apartment? Could anyone describe the precise sequence of events during the fatal confrontation? Could anyone establish a clear motive beyond speculation? These were not trivial questions. In criminal trials, the burden rests entirely upon the prosecution. Jurors are instructed not to convict because a defendant seems likely to be guilty. They must determine whether the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom became a collision between two different kinds of evidence. Scientific certainty. Human uncertainty. The DNA evidence was extraordinarily strong. The surrounding narrative contained unavoidable gaps created by the passage of time. Those gaps are common in cold case prosecutions. Detectives cannot recover memories that have disappeared. They cannot interview witnesses who have died. They cannot recreate conversations that were never recorded. Instead, they rely upon the evidence that survived. In this case, the evidence that survived happened to be extraordinarily powerful. As testimony continued, jurors learned more about the painstaking work required to preserve forensic evidence over decades. Every homicide investigation depends upon the decisions made during the first hours after a crime. Crime scene technicians in 1993 had no way of knowing that scientists nearly 30 years later would still be examining the biological evidence they carefully collected. Yet because they followed proper procedures, the evidence remained suitable for advanced testing decades later. It was a remarkable example of how meticulous police work can extend far beyond the careers of the investigators who originally performed it. Some detectives involved in the early years of the case had already retired by the time Robert Copeland was identified. Others had spent years wondering whether the child's investigation would ever be solved. For them, the courtroom represented something deeply personal. Cold case investigators often carry unresolved homicides throughout their careers. Each unsolved file represents unfinished work. A victim whose story remains incomplete. A family still waiting. The child's case had become exactly that. Not because investigators lacked determination. Because the necessary technology simply did not exist. As forensic experts described the evolution of DNA analysis, jurors gained an appreciation for just how dramatically science had changed since the early 1990s. Back then, DNA testing itself was still developing into a routine investigative tool. Today, laboratories can recover genetic information from far smaller samples, generate far more detailed profiles, and compare them using methods that were once considered impossible. Forensic genealogy represented another leap forward. Instead of asking whether a suspect already existed inside a criminal database, investigators could now begin with distant relatives and work backward through history. Family trees became investigative road maps. Genealogy became forensic evidence. The implications extended far beyond one Minneapolis homicide. Across the United States, similar investigations were identifying suspects in cases once considered permanently unsolved. Each successful prosecution reinforced public confidence in the emerging technique. Each acquittal or legal challenge helped define its boundaries. The child's case unfolded against that broader national conversation. It was no longer simply about one murder. It had become part of a transformation in criminal investigation itself. Meanwhile, Jeannie Childs remained at the center of every proceeding. Photographs introduced during the trial reminded jurors that behind the scientific terminology stood a real person whose future had ended inside a modest apartment decades earlier. Friends and relatives described not simply the tragedy of her death, but the years that followed. Birthdays without celebration. Holidays marked by absence. Questions that children eventually grew old enough to ask. The uncertainty had become part of the family's identity. Cold cases inflict a unique kind of suffering. There is grief. Then there is waiting. Waiting without answers. Waiting without accountability. Waiting while the person responsible continues living an ordinary life. For nearly 29 years, that was the reality facing Jeannie's family. Now they sat inside a courtroom listening as experts translated microscopic fragments of DNA into testimony capable of reaching back across time. It was difficult to imagine a more profound collision between past and present. The prosecution argued that the evidence formed one continuous chain. The biological material recovered in 1993. Its careful preservation. The DNA profile. The genealogical investigation. The identification of Robert Copeland. The independent DNA comparison confirming the match. Each step supported the next. No single piece stood alone. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a coherent and compelling picture. The defense urged jurors to focus instead on everything that remained unknown. No eyewitness had identified the defendant during the original investigation. No confession existed. No motive had been conclusively established. 3 decades had altered memories and erased opportunities to investigate leads that might once have been available. Both sides presented fundamentally different ways of interpreting the same passage of time. For the prosecution, time demonstrated the extraordinary durability of scientific evidence. For the defense, time represented uncertainty. Lost memories. Missing context. Questions that could no longer be answered. Ultimately, the jurors would have to decide which interpretation carried greater weight. Not based on emotion. Not based on headlines. Not based on the remarkable story of forensic genealogy. But on the evidence presented before them. Because in the end, even the most revolutionary scientific breakthrough must satisfy the oldest principle of criminal justice. The truth must be proven. The courtroom was quiet, but the weight inside it was almost physical. Every document introduced into evidence represented another year of waiting. Every exhibit carried the accumulated frustration of investigators who had refused to let the file disappear into storage forever. The murder of Jeannie Childs had outlived administrations, detectives, forensic technologies, and public attention. Yet now, under the bright lights of a courtroom, the case was no longer an aging file number. It was alive again. Jurors were not simply evaluating scientific testimony. They were measuring nearly 3 decades of investigative persistence against the constitutional standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to separate the emotional impact of a long unsolved homicide from the evidence itself. The prosecution continued to build its timeline with precision. Experts explained that DNA evidence is fundamentally different from eyewitness testimony. Human beings forget. They misidentify faces. They become influenced by time, stress, and suggestion. Biological evidence does none of those things. If properly collected and preserved, it remains exactly what it was on the day it was deposited. That distinction had defined the child's investigation from the beginning. The original detectives had recognized the importance of the biological evidence even though they lacked the technology to identify its source. Their decision to preserve every possible sample would ultimately become one of the most significant investigative choices in the history of the case. Years later, that decision would speak louder than any recollection. The prosecution also emphasized that the investigation had not leaped from an anonymous DNA profile directly to Robert Eugene Copeland. The process had unfolded in carefully documented stages. Each stage required independent verification. First came the original forensic profile. Then repeated comparisons against national criminal databases. No match. Next came advances in genetic genealogy. Then months of genealogical reconstruction. The narrowing of possible family lines. Identification of potential candidates. Traditional police investigation. Independent collection of discarded DNA. Finally, laboratory comparison between the crime scene profile and Copeland's DNA. Every step generated records. Every step could be reviewed. Every step could be challenged. That transparency mattered because modern forensic genealogy remains one of the most scrutinized investigative techniques in criminal law. The defense examined the process from another perspective. Their questions reflected concerns that have appeared in courtrooms across the United States whenever new forensic technologies emerge. How reliable are genealogy databases? Could investigators have followed the wrong family tree? Were assumptions made during the genealogical analysis? Could contamination have occurred during decades of evidence storage? Experts responded by drawing a clear distinction. Genealogy did not identify guilt. It generated investigative leads. The evidentiary foundation rested upon the direct forensic DNA comparison, conducted using established laboratory procedures independent of the genealogical research. The family tree merely pointed investigators toward an individual whose DNA was later tested directly. That distinction became increasingly important as testimony continued. Meanwhile, prosecutors introduced evidence describing the original crime scene. The apartment reflected violence. The struggle had not been brief. Investigators in 1993 documented injuries, blood evidence, and indications that Jeannie Childs fought desperately before her death. Those findings remained consistent throughout the decades. Nothing discovered during the renewed investigation contradicted the original forensic conclusions. Instead, modern science strengthened them. One by one, the pieces aligned. Not perfectly. No homicide investigation ever does. But consistently. The prosecution never claimed the case answered every question. They acknowledged that some details had been lost forever. No one could reconstruct every minute inside the apartment. No one could recover conversations that ended with Jeannie's death. No one could fully explain the killer's thoughts. Those unanswered questions remained part of the tragedy. Justice does not always restore the complete story. Sometimes it restores only accountability. That distinction resonated throughout the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, public interest continued to grow. The Childs case represented more than another cold case arrest. It became a symbol of what forensic science had achieved. News organizations across the country reported on the investigation, often focusing on the extraordinary journey from a decades-old DNA sample to a modern arrest through genetic genealogy. Families with relatives lost to unsolved homicides followed every development closely. Many saw hope. If Jeannie Childs' case could be solved after nearly 30 years, perhaps other forgotten investigations could be revived as well. Police departments quietly revisited evidence rooms. Cold case units reviewed files previously considered impossible to solve. Boxes that had remained unopened for years suddenly became valuable again. Inside them lay biological evidence collected by investigators who never imagined the scientific tools future generations would possess. The ripple effects extended far beyond Minneapolis. Yet amid the broader discussion about technology, one reality remained unchanged. A woman had been murdered. Her family had lived with unanswered questions for almost 3 decades. No scientific breakthrough could return the years they had lost. No courtroom verdict could erase the grief that had shaped their lives. Justice, if achieved, would not restore what had been taken. It would simply acknowledge responsibility. As testimony neared its conclusion, prosecutors returned repeatedly to the central issue. Presence. The DNA placed Robert Eugene Copeland in direct connection with the crime scene. The defense sought alternative explanations. Could innocent contact account for the biological evidence? Could there be another interpretation? These are common questions in criminal litigation involving DNA. Context matters. Location matters. Circumstances matter. The prosecution argued that when the biological evidence was considered together with the violent nature of the crime scene and the absence of any credible innocent explanation supported by the evidence, the conclusion was compelling. The defense insisted the passage of time itself created uncertainty. Jurors listened carefully. Unlike the public following headlines, they could not rely upon assumptions or emotion. They were instructed to evaluate only the evidence presented in court. Every witness, every exhibit, every scientific explanation, every challenge raised during cross-examination. The responsibility rested entirely with them. Cold case prosecutions often possess a unique emotional atmosphere. Everyone inside the courtroom understands that the victim has waited years for the proceedings taking place. Investigators have waited. Families have waited. Sometimes entire communities have waited. The child's case carried exactly that feeling. It was impossible to ignore the decades separating the crime from the trial. At the same time, those decades underscored something remarkable. Evidence, when preserved correctly, possesses extraordinary endurance. It does not care whether 5 years have passed, or 10, or 29. It remains available for future generations equipped with better scientific tools. The original detectives could not foresee forensic genealogy. The crime scene technicians could not anticipate databases containing millions of genetic profiles submitted for ancestry research. The laboratory analysts of 1993 could not imagine the computational power future scientists would use to reconstruct distant family relationships. Yet each had unknowingly contributed to the eventual identification of a suspect. The investigation became a testament not only to scientific innovation but also to disciplined police procedure. Without proper evidence collection in 1993, later advances would have meant nothing. Without preservation, genealogy could not help. Without documentation, DNA could not speak. Every generation of investigators inherited the work of the previous one. Each added another layer. Each moved slightly closer to an answer. And as closing arguments approached, one truth stood at the center of the entire case. For nearly 30 years, the killer, if the prosecution's evidence was correct, had believed that time itself was protection. Time had hidden his identity. Time had buried the investigation beneath newer crimes. Time had convinced the world that the case belonged to history. Instead, time had quietly become the prosecution's greatest ally. Because while memories weakened, science advanced. While witnesses aged, technology improved. While people assumed the trail had gone cold, the evidence waited patiently for the moment when someone finally possessed the tools to understand what it had been saying all along. Closing arguments brought nearly 3 decades of investigation into a single narrative. For the prosecution, the task was not simply to summarize evidence. It was to demonstrate that every scientific finding, every investigative decision, and every surviving piece of forensic evidence pointed in the same direction. The jurors had heard weeks of testimony. They had seen photographs from a crime scene preserved in time. They had listened to experts explain complex genetics in language designed for ordinary people. Now they had to decide whether all of those pieces formed one unmistakable picture. The prosecutor began where the investigation itself had begun. June 1993. A small apartment in Minneapolis. A woman whose life ended in violence. A crime scene that revealed signs of a desperate struggle. Evidence carefully collected by investigators who could not know that the most important breakthrough would arrive almost 30 years later. The prosecution reminded jurors that the biological evidence recovered from the apartment had never changed. It had remained sealed, documented, and preserved. The science evolved around it. The evidence itself did not. That distinction mattered. The defense had questioned the passage of time repeatedly. The prosecution answered with the same point again and again. Time had changed people. Time had not changed DNA. The prosecutor walked the jury through the investigation step by step. The original forensic examination. The DNA profile. Repeated database searches that produced no match. Years of frustration. The emergence of forensic genetic genealogy. The reconstruction of extended family trees. The narrowing of potential suspects. The surveillance. The collection of discarded DNA. The laboratory comparison. Each step supported the next. None depended upon speculation. None depended upon rumor. The prosecutor argued that the investigation represented one continuous chain of evidence stretching from the apartment in 1993 to the arrest nearly 29 years later. Then came the defense. Their argument focused on uncertainty rather than contradiction. No eyewitness had testified to seeing Robert Eugene Copeland commit the murder. No confession existed. No recording captured the events inside the apartment. No surviving witness could describe precisely what happened during Jeannie Child's final moments. The defense reminded jurors that criminal convictions require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not simply persuasive science. They questioned whether investigators had filled unavoidable gaps with assumptions. Could every movement inside the apartment truly be reconstructed after so many years? Could anyone identify the motive with certainty? Could anyone explain every minute leading up to the killing? The defense argued that unanswered questions remained. The prosecution responded that unanswered questions do not automatically create reasonable doubt. Investigations rarely produce perfect narratives. Murders do not unfold for the convenience of future juries. People die without leaving complete explanations. What mattered, prosecutors argued, was whether the available evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA. The location. The investigation. The direct comparison. Together, they argued, those facts formed a compelling conclusion. Jurors listened carefully. Every instruction from the judge emphasized that emotion could not replace evidence. Sympathy for Jeannie Childs and her family could not determine the verdict. Nor could admiration for scientific innovation. The verdict had to emerge solely from the evidence admitted during trial. After closing arguments concluded, the courtroom entered one of its quietest moments. The jury retired to deliberate. For investigators, waiting for a verdict often becomes more difficult than conducting the investigation itself. Months. Sometimes years. Of work suddenly pass beyond their control. There are no more witnesses to interview. No more laboratory tests to request. No additional evidence to collect. Everything rests with 12 citizens examining the facts. For Jeannie's family, the waiting carried an entirely different meaning. Nearly 30 years had already passed. Every hour of jury deliberation reopened memories they had carried since 1993. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Whatever happened next would become the final chapter of a journey that had lasted nearly 3 decades. When the jury returned, the courtroom stood. Silence settled over everyone present. The clerk prepared to read the verdict. Robert Eugene Copeland was found guilty of second-degree intentional murder in the killing of Jeannie Childs. The words were brief. Their impact was immense. For the Childs family, the verdict represented something they had nearly stopped expecting. Accountability. Not closure. Families affected by homicide often explain that there is no true closure. A conviction cannot restore birthdays missed, conversations never had, or futures permanently erased. It cannot replace a daughter, a sister, or a friend. But it can establish responsibility. It can replace uncertainty with truth. For investigators, the verdict validated decades of perseverance. The detectives who first entered Jeannie's apartment in 1993 had believed the evidence would eventually matter. They had been right. Some had retired before seeing the outcome. Some had spent years wondering whether the case would forever remain unsolved. Now the file could finally be marked differently. Not forgotten. Not abandoned. Solved. The verdict also carried significance far beyond Minneapolis. Across the country, law enforcement agencies closely followed the outcome. Forensic genetic genealogy had already produced multiple arrests, but each successful prosecution strengthened confidence in the investigative method. Each courtroom victory demonstrated that evidence developed through genealogy could withstand legal scrutiny when supported by proper forensic procedures. The child's case joined that growing body of precedent. Cold case investigators everywhere recognized the implications. Evidence rooms contain thousands of unsolved cases involving preserved biological material. Many had been collected long before genetic genealogy existed. Each case represented another possibility. Another family waiting. Another victim whose story remained unfinished. The conviction reminded investigators that some files should never be abandoned simply because technology has not yet caught up. Science changes. Evidence does not. As sentencing approached, prosecutors reflected upon the extraordinary timeline of the investigation. A murder committed in 1993. A DNA profile preserved through decades. Repeated unsuccessful database searches. The emergence of an entirely new investigative discipline. Months of genealogical research. Traditional detective work. Independent DNA confirmation. Arrest. Trial. Conviction. Nearly 30 years separated the beginning from the end. Few criminal investigations extend across such a span. Even fewer conclude successfully. The child's case demonstrated something profound about modern justice. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it simply waits for science. Outside the courthouse, reporters described the verdict as another landmark moment for forensic genealogy. Legal scholars discussed its broader implications. Police departments examined aging evidence with renewed optimism. Families of victims contacted cold case units asking whether similar techniques might help solve their own cases. Hope spread far beyond one courtroom. Yet amid the attention surrounding technology and legal precedent, the central truth remained deeply personal. A woman named Jeannie Childs had been murdered. For decades, her name appeared beside the words, "Unsolved Homicide." Now history recorded something different. A conviction. Responsibility assigned. A measure of justice finally achieved. The investigation that began inside a modest Minneapolis apartment had ultimately transformed discussions about science, law, and perseverance across the United States. But perhaps its greatest lesson was simpler. A killer may outrun detectives. He may outlive witnesses. He may survive changing neighborhoods, fading memories, and decades of silence. What he cannot outrun is evidence preserved with care. Because evidence has remarkable patience. It asks for nothing. It demands nothing. It simply waits for the day when someone possesses the knowledge to understand the truth it has carried from the very beginning. The conviction of Robert Eugene Copeland brought an official end to one of Minneapolis' longest-running murder investigations, but the story of Jeannie Childs did not end with a courtroom verdict. Because cold cases are never only about arrests. They are about time. They are about the years stolen from families who waited for answers. They are about the detectives who carried unfinished files long after the public stopped paying attention. They are about the victims whose names remained attached to a question mark for decades. For nearly 30 years, the words surrounding Jeannie Childs' name were always the same. Unsolved. Unknown. No arrest. No explanation. Then, almost 3 decades later, those words changed. A suspect had been identified. Evidence had been presented. A jury had reached a decision. The case had moved from mystery into history. But behind the headlines and scientific breakthroughs was the reality of what happened inside that apartment in 1993. A life had been taken. And no amount of technology could ever reverse that moment. The years after the conviction brought reflection on how the investigation survived long enough to reach justice. The answer was found in a combination of persistence, preservation, and scientific advancement. Each element depended on the others. Without the original investigators collecting biological evidence, there would have been nothing for future scientists to analyze. Without proper storage, the DNA profile might never have remained viable. Without the development of genetic genealogy, the evidence might have stayed anonymous forever. Without detectives willing to reopen an old file, the case could have remained untouched. The investigation was not solved by one person or one discovery. It was solved because multiple generations of investigators and scientists contributed pieces to the same unfinished puzzle. That is the defining characteristic of many modern cold case breakthroughs. The solution often begins decades earlier than the arrest. The real investigation starts at the crime scene. Every photograph taken. Every piece of evidence collected. Every report written. Every decision made by the first officers arriving at the scene. Those actions become a message sent into the future. A message that another generation of investigators may eventually decode. The Jeannie Childs investigation became an example of that principle. In 1993, detectives could only do what the technology of the time allowed. They created a DNA profile. They searched available databases. They interviewed people. They followed leads. But the final answer remained hidden. The case did not fail. It simply entered a waiting period. That distinction changed how law enforcement viewed cold cases. For many years, unsolved investigations were often considered cases where something had gone wrong. A missing witness. A lost opportunity. An incomplete investigation. Modern forensic advances introduced another possibility. Sometimes a case remains unsolved because the necessary tool does not exist yet. Science creates new doors. The challenge is recognizing which old cases are waiting behind them. After the Copeland conviction, discussions about forensic genealogy intensified. Supporters pointed to cases like Jeannie Childs as evidence that the technology could provide answers where traditional methods had reached their limits. They argued that victims and families deserved every possible opportunity for justice. Critics continued raising concerns about privacy, consent, and the expanding role of genetic information in criminal investigations. The debate was complex. DNA contains deeply personal information. Family relationships. Ancestry. Biological connections. The same information that can identify a murderer can also reveal unexpected details about people who never intended to participate in a criminal investigation. These questions became increasingly important as more law enforcement agencies turned to genetic genealogy. How should the technology be regulated? Who should have access? What safeguards should exist? Where should the line be drawn between public safety and personal privacy? The Jeannie Childs case existed within this larger national conversation. It represented both the promise of modern science and the difficult questions that came with it. But for the people closest to the case, the debate was secondary. For Jeannie's loved ones, the most important fact was much simpler. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew who had been held responsible. The impact of that knowledge cannot be measured only through legal documents. For families of homicide victims, unanswered questions create a unique form of suffering. They are forced to imagine possibilities. They wonder whether justice will ever come. They wonder whether the person responsible is nearby. They wonder whether every ordinary moment is being lived by someone who knows the truth. That uncertainty can become its own punishment. For decades, Jeannie's family carried that burden. Then the arrest changed everything. The person they had waited for had a name. The investigation had a direction. The case had movement. Even before the trial concluded, the psychological weight of uncertainty had already begun to shift. The question was no longer, who did this? The question became, how will justice be delivered? That transformation is one of the most significant moments in any cold case investigation. The unknown becomes known. The impossible becomes possible. The silence begins to break. Years after the original crime, detectives who worked the case reflected on the importance of patience. Cold case investigators understand something that the public often does not. Not every investigation moves quickly. Not every mystery is solved through a dramatic confession or a sudden witness revelation. Sometimes the answer arrives slowly. Sometimes it requires technology that has not yet been invented. Sometimes the evidence sits quietly for decades before the world finally learns how to interpret it. The murder of Jeannie Childs demonstrated that justice has its own timeline. Not always the timeline families want. Not always the timeline investigators hope for. But a timeline shaped by persistence and possibility. The case also changed how future investigators viewed preserved evidence. A biological sample collected decades earlier was no longer considered old evidence. It was future evidence. A potential answer waiting for the right question. Police departments across the country began reassessing their cold case inventories. Files once considered impossible were reopened. Evidence once considered outdated gained new importance. The lessons were clear. Never assume a case is permanently unsolvable. Never assume technology has reached its limit. Never underestimate evidence that survives. Because every cold case contains a story that has not finished being told. For Jeannie Childs, that story lasted almost 30 years. It began with violence. It continued through silence. It survived uncertainty. And it eventually reached a courtroom where a jury recognized the weight of the evidence. But even after the conviction, some questions remained. Not every detail of that night would ever be recovered. Not every moment could be reconstructed. Not every mystery surrounding a human life can be completely answered. That is one of the hardest truths in criminal investigations. A conviction can establish who was responsible. It cannot always explain everything. The past does not reopen perfectly. It opens in fragments. A piece of DNA. A forgotten record. A witness memory. A scientific discovery. A connection hidden inside a family tree. Each fragment brings investigators closer. And sometimes, those fragments are enough. The case of Jeannie Childs became a reminder that even the darkest investigations can change direction decades later. The passage of time does not always protect those responsible for terrible crimes. Sometimes time becomes the force that exposes them. Because while a person may believe they have buried the past, evidence has a different nature. It does not forget. It does not move on. It remains. Waiting beneath layers of years. Waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for science to unlock it. Waiting for the truth to finally be heard. The story of Jeannie Childs' murder had traveled through 3 different eras of criminal investigation. The first era belonged to traditional detective work. The second belonged to DNA science. The third belonged to genetic genealogy. Each era brought new possibilities. Each era revealed new limitations. And together, they created a path that eventually led investigators back to a crime scene that had remained silent for nearly 30 years. But behind the technology and the courtroom arguments was a deeper question that continued to surround the case. How does a murder survive in memory for so long? Why do some cases refuse to disappear? The answer lies in the people left behind. For families of homicide victims, time does not move in the same way it moves for everyone else. The world continues. Seasons change. Buildings are demolished and rebuilt. New generations grow up. But the moment of loss remains permanently fixed. For Jeannie Childs' loved ones, June 1993 was not simply a date in history. It was the day their lives divided into before and after. Before the phone call. Before the police investigation. Before the unanswered questions. After the silence. After the waiting. After years of wondering whether the person responsible would ever face consequences. Cold cases create a unique emotional reality. The wound is never allowed to fully close because the story never reaches an ending. There is no trial. No verdict. No final acknowledgement. Only uncertainty. Families often describe this period as living between 2 worlds. They know their loved one is gone. But they do not know everything that happened. They cannot fully understand the final moments. They cannot hold anyone accountable. And they cannot escape the possibility that the person responsible may still be somewhere nearby. That uncertainty was part of Jeannie's family's reality for decades. The investigation became a permanent presence. Every new detective assigned to the case carried the hope of finding something previous investigators had missed. Every technological advance created another possibility. Every year without an answer brought another disappointment. Then forensic genealogy changed the direction of the investigation. The same genetic information that people around the world used to discover their ancestry became the tool that reopened a murder investigation. A family tree became a crime-solving instrument. A distant relative became a clue. A historical record became evidence. It was a remarkable transformation. The process demonstrated something investigators had learned repeatedly in cold cases. The smallest details can become the most important details when viewed through the right technology. A document written decades earlier. A biological sample collected during a crime scene examination. A record stored in a database. A connection invisible to investigators of the past. Everything can matter. The investigation into Jeannie Child's murder also highlighted another important reality. Solving a cold case is not simply about finding a suspect. It is about reconstructing a story. Investigators must understand where a person was, who they knew, how they moved through the world, whether their history aligns with the evidence. The genetic connection created a path. Traditional detective work created the explanation. Together, those methods transformed an unknown profile into a complete investigation. The process was slow. It required patience. But patience has always been one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case work. Detectives cannot force evidence to appear. They cannot manufacture answers. They can only preserve what exists and wait for the moment when new information becomes available. That philosophy changed the way law enforcement viewed old investigations. A case sitting untouched in an archive was no longer necessarily a dead case. It could be a case waiting for a breakthrough. The murder of Jeannie Childs became part of that transformation. The investigation showed that time itself could become a source of power. The same years that allowed a suspect to believe he had escaped also allowed technology to advance beyond imagination. In 1993, investigators could identify an unknown DNA profile. In later years, they could identify a family connection. Eventually, they could identify the individual connected to that evidence. The timeline of the case mirrored the evolution of forensic science itself. But science alone did not solve the investigation. Human determination remained essential. Behind every successful cold case resolution are people who refuse to accept that an unanswered question should remain unanswered forever. Detectives who reopen old files. Laboratory technicians who carefully examine decades-old evidence. Genealogists who spend countless hours reconstructing family histories. Prosecutors who build cases from fragments. Families who continue asking for justice long after the public moves on. The Jeannie Childs investigation represented all of those efforts combined. As the years passed after the conviction, the case continued to be studied by law enforcement professionals interested in the future of criminal investigations. It became another example of how forensic genealogy could transform cases that once appeared impossible. But experts also recognized the responsibility that came with this new power. Technology capable of solving crimes must be used carefully. The same genetic information that can bring justice to victims can affect the privacy of innocent people connected to suspects. The future of forensic genealogy would depend not only on scientific ability but also on ethical decisions. Clear standards. Responsible oversight. Respect for individual rights. The debate would continue. But the central purpose remained unchanged. To find answers for victims. To hold offenders accountable. To ensure that time does not become a shield against justice. For the detectives who worked the child's case, perhaps the most meaningful aspect was not the technology itself. It was what the technology represented. A promise. A promise that victims would not be forgotten. A promise that evidence would not become meaningless simply because years had passed. A promise that an investigation could survive beyond the careers of the people who started it. The murder of Jeannie Childs began as a tragedy inside a Minneapolis apartment. It became a decades-long search for truth. It became a test of investigative patience. It became an example of scientific advancement. And ultimately, it became a reminder that some cases are never truly abandoned. They remain hidden. Waiting. The passage of time creates distance. But evidence can cross that distance. A fingerprint may fade. A memory may disappear. A witness may no longer be available. But DNA can remain. And when science finally catches up with the evidence, the past can suddenly become present again. That is what happened in the Jeannie Childs investigation. A case that appeared frozen. A name that had nearly disappeared from headlines. A crime that many believed belonged permanently to another era. All of it returned. Not because someone suddenly remembered. Not because someone finally confessed. But because a silent biological trace carried a message through time. A message that investigators eventually learned how to read. And when they did, the mystery surrounding Jeannie Childs began to unravel. The man who had remained unidentified for decades was no longer hidden behind time. The unanswered questions that had haunted investigators and family members finally had an answer. But the story of the case was never only about the person responsible. It was also about the woman whose life was taken. A woman whose name survived because people refused to stop searching. A woman whose story continued because evidence remained. A woman whose case became a symbol of something larger. That justice may be delayed. That investigations may become cold. That years may pass. But the truth does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it requires an entirely new generation of science to uncover it. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest piece of evidence becomes the loudest voice of all. The murder of Jeannie Childs became more than a solved homicide. It became a case study in the changing relationship between crime, technology, and time. For decades, investigators believed they were fighting against the clock. Every passing year seemed to weaken the possibility of justice. Witnesses disappeared. Memories faded. Evidence became harder to interpret. The world moved further away from the crime. But the investigation eventually revealed a different reality. Time was not only an enemy. It was also a witness. The evidence collected in 1993 had survived every year that followed. It remained untouched while technology advanced around it. And when science finally developed the ability to interpret what had been preserved, the past came back with extraordinary force. The story of Jeannie Childs demonstrated one of the most powerful principles in modern criminal investigation. A case is not always cold because the truth is gone. Sometimes it is cold because the truth is waiting. Waiting for better tools. Waiting for new investigators. Waiting for someone willing to look again. The breakthrough in the Childs investigation reflected a transformation that was reshaping law enforcement across the United States. For generations, detectives relied primarily on interviews, physical evidence, and traditional investigative methods. Those methods remain essential. But the arrival of advanced genetic analysis introduced a new dimension. A person could leave a clue without knowing it. A family connection could reveal an identity without revealing the suspect directly. A biological trace from decades earlier could suddenly become a pathway into the present. For investigators, this changed the way they viewed old evidence. A box stored in an evidence room was no longer simply a reminder of an unsolved crime. It was a potential source of future answers. Inside those boxes were pieces of history. Objects collected during investigations that had outlasted the original detectives. Evidence preserved by people who never knew exactly how important it might become. The Jeannie Childs case showed why those decisions mattered. The officers who investigated the crime in 1993 were working with the knowledge and technology available at that moment. They could not see the future. They could not predict genetic genealogy. They could not imagine that DNA databases would one day contain millions of profiles connected through ancestry research. Yet they made decisions that allowed future investigators to succeed. That is the hidden foundation of every cold case breakthrough. The future depends on the choices made in the past. While the conviction brought justice, it also raised difficult questions about the nature of memory. A murder committed nearly 30 years earlier had finally reached a courtroom. But what happens to the years in between? For the family of Jeannie Childs, those years could never be recovered. The investigation may have ended. The grief did not. This is something often misunderstood about cold cases. A solved case does not erase the damage. It does not restore the person who was lost. It does not return the moments stolen from families. A conviction answers one question. Who was responsible? It cannot answer another. What would life have looked like if the crime had never happened? That question remains forever. For many victims' families, justice is not about moving on. It is about moving forward while carrying the memory of someone who should still be present. The story of Jeannie Childs continued to resonate because it represented thousands of families facing similar uncertainty. Across America, countless homicide cases remain unresolved. Some involve evidence collected decades ago. Some involve unidentified suspects. Some involve victims whose names have disappeared from public attention. But the success of investigations like the Childs case created renewed hope. A case considered impossible today may not be impossible tomorrow. Technology changes the definition of what can be solved. The impossible becomes temporary. The unknown becomes discoverable. The forgotten becomes visible again. Forensic genealogy became one of the most significant examples of this transformation. But experts understood that the technique was not magic. It required expertise. It required careful analysis. It required traditional investigative work. Most importantly, it required patience. The genetic profile alone did not solve the murder. The family tree alone did not solve the murder. The arrest came because multiple forms of evidence connected together. Science created the opportunity. Detectives created the case. The courtroom determined the outcome. Each part was necessary. This balance became one of the major lessons from the investigation. Technology can open doors. But human judgment determines how those doors are used. The investigators handling the Childs case faced enormous responsibility. They had to follow the evidence wherever it led. They had to avoid assumptions. They had to distinguish between a possibility and a fact. That discipline is what separates an investigation from a theory. Cold cases often attract speculation. Years without answers create rumors. People search for explanations. Communities create their own versions of events. But justice cannot be built on speculation. It must be built on evidence. The Childs investigation ultimately succeeded because evidence remained at the center. Not rumors. Not public pressure. Not emotional conclusions. Evidence. The conviction also served as a reminder that criminals often underestimate the endurance of forensic science. A person may believe that enough time has passed. They may believe witnesses have forgotten. They may believe technology cannot reach backward. But every year brings new scientific possibilities. The evidence left behind in a moment of violence can continue speaking long after everyone involved has moved forward. That reality has changed criminal behavior itself. Modern offenders understand that DNA can expose them years later. The idea of the perfect crime has become increasingly difficult to defend. A person may escape immediate detection. But escaping forever is another matter. The Jeannie Childs case became another example of that truth. A suspect who remained unidentified for decades was eventually connected to the crime through evidence preserved from the original investigation. The passage of time created distance. Science eliminated that distance. As years passed after the conviction, the case remained a powerful reminder of perseverance. It showed investigators why old files matter. It showed families why hope can survive. It showed communities that unanswered questions do not always remain unanswered forever. The apartment where Jeannie Childs died became a symbol of that journey. A place once associated only with tragedy became connected with another story. A story about persistence. A story about scientific progress. A story about a justice system that continued searching even after decades had passed. The investigation crossed generations. The detectives who began it were not the same people who completed it. The technology used at the end did not exist at the beginning. The world itself had changed. But one thing remained constant. The desire to know the truth. That desire carried the case from 1993 into the modern era. It carried a family through decades of uncertainty. It carried evidence through decades of silence. And eventually, it carried the name of Jeannie Childs from a cold case file into a story of resolution. Yet even after the arrest, the trial, and the conviction, one final reality remained. Every solved case leaves behind an echo. A reminder of what happened. A reminder of what was lost. A reminder that behind every investigation is a human life. And for Jeannie Childs, that life was the reason the search continued. Not the headlines. Not the technology. Not the scientific achievement. The reason was simple. A woman deserved justice. And after nearly 30 years, the world finally heard the evidence that had been waiting all along.